Set in the multicultural but conservative suburbs of Miami, Florida. The story of Maria Fernandez, a Venezuelan immigrant in her late 20s, unravels into a nightmare as her clandestine affair with her father-in-law, James Spencer, spirals into deadly violence. What starts as a forbidden romance in 2011 ends with a brutal murder in 2012, leaving a family fractured and a community reeling. This case delves into the dark themes of racism, obsession, betrayal, and the unraveling consequences of forbidden love. On the foggy morning of April 17, 2012, the local Miami police receive a chilling 911 call. Maria's husband, David Spencer, finds his father, James, dead in the family's guest house, brutally stabbed and surrounded by a chaotic scene of broken furniture and shattered glass. Suspicion quickly swirls, and as investigators dig into the events, shocking details about Maria's life and her relationship with James come to light. A somber investigation ensues, gradually peeling back the layers of secrets hidden beneath an ordinary family's life. Maria Fernandez was born in a small, bustling town in Venezuela in the early 1980s. From a young age, she was known for her fiery personality and her drive to create a better life for herself. Growing up amid political unrest and economic turmoil, Maria's childhood was far from easy. She was raised by her mother, a seamstress, after her father left when she was only 5. They lived modestly, often scraping by, but Maria's mother instilled in her a belief in hard work and independence. Maria dreamed of a life where she could live without fear, where she could be in control of her own destiny. She yearned to see the world beyond her small town, away from the limitations that surrounded her. In 2009, Maria seized the opportunity to move to the United States, a decision that filled her with both excitement and fear. At just 26, she left behind everything she had known, trading it for the unknown shores of Miami, where she was told opportunities were limitless. She envisioned herself achieving financial security, maybe starting a business one day, and perhaps building a family. For Maria, coming to America was a fresh start, a chance to find herself and define her future. But the reality of Miami life was different from her dreams. The cost of living was high, and without a support system, she struggled to find steady work. The language barrier made things worse, and the homesickness began to weigh on her. Then, in 2010, Maria met David Spencer. David was a man of American privilege with a seemingly perfect life. He was wealthy, coming from a family that owned several real estate properties across Miami. David was charming, and to Maria, he represented stability. Their whirlwind romance was a surprise to everyone, including Maria. David was captivated by her resilience and beauty, qualities that he rarely found in the circles he frequented. For Maria, David was like a lifeline, someone who could help her build the life she longed for. They married within a year, and Maria, though somewhat unsure about the rapid pace, told herself this was the path to the security she desired. But as time passed, cracks began to appear in the relationship. David's controlling nature started to emerge in subtle ways. He would discourage her from working, saying that he could provide for both of them, and insisted that her role was to support him and take care of their home. Initially, Maria appreciated his protectiveness, seeing it as a form of love, but soon it became stifling. She found herself feeling trapped, as if her life had lost the vibrancy she once imagined. David had strong opinions about how his wife should act, dress, and even speak, constantly reminding her that she was now part of his world and should fit in accordingly. Maria's once bright spirit dimmed, replaced by a quiet resentment that she kept buried. When David brought her into his family, Maria quickly noticed how different she was from everyone else. His family, though civil, held quiet prejudices that made her uncomfortable. They would make offhand comments about her accent, her culture, even her appearance. She was exotic to them, a term that left her feeling alienated rather than accepted. This underlying prejudice created a distance that Maria felt keenly, as though she would never truly belong. It was during one of these family gatherings in late 2011 that Maria met James Spencer, David's father. James was a towering figure, not only in appearance, but in influence. At 63, he was a self-made man who owned multiple properties across Miami. He was known in the community as a shrewd businessman, deeply conservative, and unapologetically old-fashioned. With his white hair slicked back and a steely gaze, he was both intimidating and fascinating. Unlike David, who was somewhat soft-spoken, James held an undeniable presence, his opinions sharp and often colored with an undertone of racial prejudice. Though he never outright dismissed Maria, his words often carried a subtle condescension that reminded her of her outsider status. At first, Maria kept her distance from James, wary of his overbearing nature and his reputation. But as time passed, their paths crossed more frequently. David's work often kept him away from home, leaving Maria to handle family gatherings alone. During these occasions, she would find herself seated next to James, engaging in conversations that, though initially polite, grew more personal over time. James, too, found himself unexpectedly drawn to Maria. She was different from any woman he had known, fiery, ambitious, and passionate about life. He began to see her not as his son's wife, but as an intriguing, beautiful woman who stirred something within him. James's attraction to Maria was complicated. He often told himself it was harmless, yet his admiration grew each time they met. He admired her resilience, her ability to navigate a world that wasn't always welcoming to her, and he found himself longing to be a part of that energy. Maria, on her end, saw in James a blend of danger and intrigue. He represented a rebellion against the confines of her marriage, a chance to feel powerful and desired. Slowly, almost unintentionally, they began to exchange lingering glances and subtle touches. What began as innocent encounters, family dinners, quiet conversations after gatherings, gradually became moments filled with unspoken tension. By the end of 2011, Maria and James were locked in a silent dance of attraction, one that was both thrilling and terrifying. Maria knew the risks, but found herself unable to resist the pull. James, too, was conflicted, torn between his desire and the knowledge that he was crossing boundaries that could destroy his family. Despite the risks, their attraction continued to grow, each stolen moment intensifying the emotional stakes. In the quiet hours of the early days of the 2012, they crossed the line. There were no grand declarations or promises, only the intoxicating thrill of forbidden love. It was a tangled mix of desire, power, and rebellion, each encounter leaving them more entrapped. For Maria, these stolen moments offered an escape from the control and prejudice she felt within David's family, a chance to reclaim the freedom she had always yearned for. For James, it was a way to feel young again, to grasp at vitality he feared was slipping away. They told themselves it was just a phase, something they could control and end when they wished. But the reality was far more complex. Their secret meetings became frequent, hidden under the guise of family obligations. Each time they met, they knew the stakes, yet neither could pull away. What neither of them realized was just how dangerous this dance had become. In their quest for excitement and control, they had set into motion a series of events that would lead them down a dark path, one where the price of their desire would become deadly. By early 2012, the cracks in Maria and David's marriage had widened, though they both tried to maintain appearances. David was growing increasingly wary. Subtle changes in Maria's behavior, her sudden defensiveness, her insistence on spending more time alone, planted seeds of doubt in his mind. He noticed how her phone was always within arm's reach, and the quick, nervous glances she cast when he entered a room. These small details fed his suspicions, and his gaze grew colder, his demeanor sharper. His jealousy intensified when he observed his father's unusual attention to Maria. For David, this betrayal was layered with another unspoken frustration: the underlying resentment toward Maria's foreign background, which he saw as a reminder of her difference, an outsider presence in his family. David's unspoken racism began surfacing in bitter accusations that framed Maria as someone who had manipulated her way into their family, casting her as a gold digger and belittling her ambitions. He hinted that her motives for marrying him were shallow, reducing her dreams to mere greed. Though he never said it directly, his words carried a loaded meaning, making Maria feel smaller and more alienated. These comments cut deeply, undermining Maria's sense of belonging and security, leaving her feeling trapped, yet defiant. She denied his accusations, insisting she was faithful, but the tension between them grew too thick to ignore. Amidst this rising discord, James's behavior turned more erratic. His once quiet longing for Maria evolved into a desperate obsession. Feeling Maria pull away, he found himself unwilling to let go. His need to maintain control over her intensified, manifesting in unexpected visits to the main house. These unannounced visits seemed casual to onlookers, yet there was an edge of possessiveness in his gaze, a hunger that made Maria increasingly uncomfortable. She felt his presence looming, his gaze lingering a moment too long, and she realized with a sinking feeling that her relationship with James had veered into dangerous territory. Maria began distancing herself, aware of the fragile stability she was trying to salvage with David. Yet, each attempt to move away from James only drove him further into desperation. He started calling her, showing up late at night outside her door, making it clear he was not willing to let her walk away. She felt the tension mounting, as if their secret was tightening into a noose. Despite her fear, she knew she had to end the affair before it destroyed everything. But she underestimated how entangled James had become. James's obsession blinded him, pushing him to make increasingly reckless moves. He would confront her in secluded corners during family gatherings, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with insistence and frustration. Each conversation grew more intense, more dangerous. Maria was trapped between her guilt and her fear of what he might do if she broke things off. She was desperate to escape, but felt the walls closing in, her options dwindling. On the night of April 15th, David, fueled by his suspicions and simmering anger, decided it was time to confront his father. The tension had become unbearable, his jealousy transforming into rage. David wanted answers, and he wanted to lay bare whatever had been brewing between Maria and his father. He planned to confront James the following night, hoping to reclaim some semblance of control over his crumbling marriage and family. But fate intervened in a far more brutal way than he had imagined. On April 16th, 2012, the quiet neighborhood was disrupted by a series of raised voices coming from the Spencer family's guest house. Neighbors later recalled hearing muffled shouting, the sounds of a heated argument. It was a familiar scene in this community, but tonight something felt different, charged. Inside the guest house, Maria and James had engaged in one of their most intense confrontations yet. Maria was determined to end things once and for all, her voice shaking as she demanded he leave her alone. She could feel the weight of the affair bearing down on her, consuming everything she had tried to protect. What happened next would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. By morning, James Spencer was found dead. His body lay on the guest house floor, a chaotic scene of overturned furniture and shattered glass surrounding him. His lifeless form bore multiple stab wounds, and the blood-smeared floor told the story of a violent struggle. Maria was in shock, her hands trembling, her face pale, as she tried to process the horror before her. The stillness of the room felt oppressive, the silence deafening as she stood over his body, unable to comprehend the full extent of what had just unfolded. In the early hours of April 17th, the Miami police arrived at the scene, responding to a frantic 911 call reporting a brutal crime at the Spencer residence. The sight awaiting them was unsettling, a grim tableau of violence and betrayal that shattered the peaceful facade of the wealthy family's life. Detective Marcus Lopez, a seasoned investigator known for his methodical approach, led the case, his sharp gaze taking in every detail of the chaotic scene. With bloodstains on her clothes and visible distress, Maria became an immediate person of interest. Her fingerprints and text messages linking her to James hinted at a relationship far more complicated than she initially let on. As the detectives began questioning Maria, her visible distress did little to ease their suspicions. She insisted she was innocent, claiming that when she arrived, James was already gravely injured. But her words seemed to falter under the intensity of the detective's scrutiny. Her initial explanations lacked clarity, and Detective Lopez sensed there was more to the story than Maria was revealing. In the days that followed, from April 18th to April 25th, detectives unearthed a slew of evidence that painted a clearer, yet far more shocking picture. Photos, explicit messages, and even a hidden folder on James's computer revealed an affair that had been going on for months. The messages between Maria and James were graphic, emotionally charged, exposing a side of both individuals that had been carefully hidden. As news of the affair broke, it sent shockwaves through the Spencer family, leaving David devastated and enraged. David, barely containing his emotions, confronted Maria in a police interview room, unable to hold back his feelings of betrayal. He demanded answers, seeking some explanation for the affair that had shattered his world. Maria, exhausted and broken, claimed that she had been manipulated, that James had drawn her into a relationship she couldn't escape. She painted herself as a victim, caught in the web of James's desires. unable to resist his influence. Yet, despite her defense, her guilt seemed palpable, a shadow that hung over every word she spoke. On April 26th, the investigation took a brief turn as suspicion momentarily shifted toward David. His recent threats and the unresolved anger toward both Maria and his father made him a potential suspect, especially given the turbulent relationship he shared with both of them. Detectives carefully examined his alibi, searching for inconsistencies, but David's story held. He had been elsewhere during the night of the murder, his alibi corroborated by witnesses, though the resentment he harbored toward his father and wife became evident in his demeanor during questioning. The emotional scars of betrayal and family tensions were laid bare, providing insight into the strained dynamics that had contributed to the unfolding tragedy. Each layer of the investigation uncovered a new facet of this dark web, drawing everyone deeper into the complex emotions that had fueled the crime. The more the detectives dug, the murkier the truth became, leaving them questioning not only who was responsible, but what circumstances had driven these individuals to such a devastating breaking point. By the July 2012, the case had reached a boiling point. It was the story everyone in Miami was talking about. The trial that brought to light a scandal so shocking that it split the community into factions. Maria Fernandez was charged with second-degree murder for the death of James Spencer, a case tangled with accusations, betrayal, and unspoken prejudice. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with journalists, curious locals, and those who had once admired the Spencer family's wealth and influence. Now, the same people were watching as the family's darkest secrets were laid bare. The prosecution, led by a determined assistant district attorney, painted Maria as a master manipulator. They argued that Maria had used her beauty and charm to seduce James, exploiting his weaknesses for her own gain. In their narrative, she was calculating, using the affair as leverage, always angling for an advantage. They pointed to the messages exchanged between her and James, claiming that Maria's words were too polished, too intentional, to be anything but a trap, set by a woman with ambition. Every piece of evidence, the late-night text, the stolen glances observed by family members, and even the rumors whispered by neighbors, was framed to reinforce the image of Maria as a cunning seductress who had led James down a dark path, ultimately ending in his death. But Maria's defense team took a different approach. They argued that Maria had acted out of desperation and fear, that she was a young immigrant woman ensnared in a relationship she had been forced into by James's power and persistence. They contended that James was not a helpless man. He was a wealthy, influential figure who knew how to use his status to get what he wanted. In their version of events, Maria was not a seductress, but a woman trapped in an affair she could not escape. They highlighted her vulnerability, the way James's charisma had cornered her, making her feel as though she had no way out. The testimonies were emotional and contradictory, each one adding a new layer to the complex web of relationships that had led to James's death. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments and seeing James visit Maria at odd hours, describing moments that painted both Maria and James in an ambiguous light. Some remembered Maria as a reserved woman, someone who had always seemed slightly out of place in the wealthy Spencer family, while others recalled her as confident and alluring. A woman who seemed to enjoy the attention. Family members took the stand, their stories filled with grief and bitterness. David, shattered by betrayal, struggled to balance his conflicting emotions. He wanted justice, but was also grappling with a loyalty that was difficult to shake, even after all he had discovered about Maria and his father. The trial stretched on for weeks, and each day weighed heavily on Maria. She sat in the courtroom, facing her accusers, the eyes of the public on her. As witnesses recounted conversations they claimed to have overheard, Maria felt the burden of judgment pressing down on her. She could feel the divide forming between those who saw her as a woman caught in tragic circumstances and those who saw her as the orchestrator of a violent scheme. Her defense team did their best to emphasize her struggles, reminding the court of her background, her isolation, and the cultural gap that had always set her apart from the Spencer family. But the prosecution relentlessly portrayed her as a danger, a woman who had seen an opportunity and taken it without a second thought. The final days of the trial were tense, and by the August 15th, 2012, everyone in the room could sense that a decision was imminent. The jury deliberated for hours, each member wrestling with the conflicting evidence, the raw emotions, and the moral weight of the case. When they finally returned, they announced a verdict of guilty, not for murder, but for manslaughter. It was a decision that left the room in shock. Maria would serve a sentence of 10 years, a compromise between those who saw her as a victim and those who saw her as a criminal. As the sentence was read, Maria felt a mix of emotions, sorrow, relief, and a deep, unshakable regret for the choices she had made and the lives that had been destroyed. Miami's community was split in its response. For some, justice had been served. Maria had faced the consequences of her actions. Others felt that the court had failed her, that she was simply another immigrant woman who had been misunderstood, caught in a tragic web of power and prejudice that she could not escape. Her story became a symbol of division, a conversation that lingered in the streets and homes, leaving people to argue about who was truly at fault and what justice really meant. In the years following the trial, the Spencer family fell into quiet disarray. David, unable to reconcile his past, left Miami, moving far enough away to try and rebuild his life. Yet, he was haunted by the events that had shattered his family. The betrayal had carved deep wounds, leaving him adrift, struggling to find closure. He distanced himself from relationships, wary of letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. His memories of Maria and his father became ghosts that haunted his mind, fragments of a past he could neither escape nor fully remember without pain. Maria, meanwhile, served her sentence with a heavy heart. The once vibrant woman who had come to America with dreams of freedom now spent her days reflecting on the choices that had led her here. Each year in prison was a reminder of the life she had lost, the love that had turned to ruin, and the prejudices that had shaped her journey. She thought often of the cultural and social forces that had played a role in her tragic relationship with the Spencers. The racial undertones, the subtle prejudices she had endured, and the barriers she had faced as an outsider all lingered in her mind. She wondered if things might have been different had she been born in different circumstances, or if she had met someone else, someone who had seen her as more than just a stranger in their world. Over time, the public memory of the case faded, yet it left a lasting mark on those involved. Maria's story became a cautionary tale, retold by locals as a dark reminder of love gone wrong and the dangerous consequences of prejudice and obsession. The case was a reflection of the biases and hidden tensions that lay beneath the surface, issues that Miami's community had rarely addressed so openly. People would remember the Spencer family and the affair that had spiraled into tragedy. But for Maria and David, the story was personal, a scar they would carry with them forever. As Maria served her final years, she reflected on the paths that had led her to this point. She thought about her mother in Venezuela, the sacrifices she had made, and the hopes they had shared. She wondered if there was redemption waiting for her, a chance to start again once her sentence was over. Yet she knew the life she had once envisioned was gone, replaced by the weight of a past she could not undo. The tragedy of her story lay not only in the choices she had made, but in the way those choices had been shaped by forces beyond her control. A mix of love, ambition, and a desperate need to belong that had ultimately led to ruin. The case of Maria Fernandez and the twisted love affair that led to James Spencer's death remains one of the most chilling tales of love, betrayal, and obsession in Miami's history. As families heal and communities learn, this story serves as a stark reminder of the dark complexities behind seemingly ordinary lives. It also reminds us of a much similar case, a case where a Venezuelan immigrant's affair with married neighbor ends deadly. Don't forget to check out that video and like and subscribe so you do not miss out on our daily updates.